Well, hello and welcome to my YouTube. My name is Jane and today I'm going to be talking about the wonderful knitted sweaters which are on display in the Elsa Schiaparelli show at the V&A in London at the moment. Now, when I went to the exhibition a couple of days ago, I had intended just to go around and to film really all the beautiful couture dresses and then to make a film. There was a tour, a bit like the Marie Antoinette one that I did. And I did do that. You know, I have all of the films and I will put them together probably in a couple of weeks' time. But when I was on the train coming home, I just started to think about the knitwear, which is really at the beginning of Schiaparelli's career in a slightly different business. And I'm always intrigued by how businesses begin and who's involved, because it's never as straightforward as the origin stories would lead us to believe. And as I kind of picked my way through things, a much more interesting story began to evolve. And that's the story that I want to talk about today, really from 1920 to 1929. There is a great writer of biography called Anna Funder, and I've heard her talk about how when she's doing her reading through resources or through older books, every time she comes to somebody who is just described in one word, like publisher or editor or buyer or whatever, she always tries to track that particular thread, because 9 times out of 10 that will lead her to a really interesting woman, a woman in position of power, a woman who made things happen, but who has for some reason been written out, made invisible by history. So that's basically how I started this. So Elsa Schiaparelli in 1919, who was she? So Elsa Schiaparelli grew up in an incredibly privileged family. Her mother was descended from Naples aristocrats, had lots of money. Her father was from a kind of a big Italian academic family, also lots of money. They were really well connected. Elsa grew up in a palatial mansion in Rome. To give kind of like an idea of the money, when she was in her late teens, it was decided that she would get an allowance. This was kind of like pocket money. It wasn't a clothes allowance, it wasn't a housing allowance or anything like that. This was her pocket money for incidentals. And she was given per week the equivalent of £250. So that's kind of the level of just money always being around. But she found this upbringing incredibly restrictive, and she was always wanting to get out of it. She felt that she couldn't do anything, there was no creativity. So when she was 19, she took a job that was basically kind of a nanny kind of job in an orphanage in the countryside in England. And on her way to England, she stayed 10 days in Paris, which she loved. She loved the exhibitions and the art, and then a couple of days in London, which she also loved. So any time that she had free from her nannying job, she would go to London. She would look at exhibitions, she would go to lectures. She saw a poster for a talk being given by Count William. It was on philosophy. She went to see that. And it was a mix of all kinds of religions, along with the occult. He was very charismatic. She was bowled over. She stayed at the end and met him. Presumably went home with him. The next day, they were engaged to be married. Her parents hot-footed it from Italy to try and stop the marriage, but they failed. And age 19, Schiaparelli was a countess. Now, her husband was actually a bit of a scam artist. He was imprisoned for fortune telling, which was illegal in England. And when he got out of prison, they moved to France. So the time of the First World War, so they were largely in the south of France. He had started to have lots of affairs. She felt a bit abandoned. She went to Monte Carlo. She managed to lose all of her fortune, all of her money on the gaming tables, and was sent back home on a train ticket that was courtesy of the casino. So they had gone from having a lot of money, from Elsa being independently wealthy, to being very short of cash, and we know nothing about what happened from that point until 1919, when they were on a boat to New York, to America, presumably to find some way of earning a living. Elsa Schiaparelli was assistant to her husband in his displays and fortune telling. But the important thing about this for our story is that on that boat, Elsa Schiaparelli met Gabrielle Buffet-Picabia. Gabby Picabia was 10 years older than Elsa Schiaparelli. She had 4 children. She had already lived in New York during the First World War. She had lots of contacts there. And this trip was a money-making trip. She was estranged from her husband. She had 4 children. She had a plan to take some trunks of couture from Paris to New York to sell it, to make enough money to live on. So that's what she was doing there. But she got on really well with the young Elsa Schiaparelli. They found that they could talk about art. And, they had like a kind of like on-board friendship. They didn't meet each other once they got to New York. This is not kind of lifelong friendship from that point on. But a couple of years later, Gabby Picabia is there with more couture and looking for a salesperson. She speaks to a friend who is an American doctor, and he suggests that it might be the kind of job that one of his new patients might find really useful. She's an Italian countess. She's a bit hard up, and a bit, luck's not been going too well for her. Elsa and Gabby arrange a meeting. They realise that they have met. Elsa at this point has separated from Count William. She is living with her infant daughter in a series of hotels. She has no money. She is hitting that point that single women, single mothers in particular, often do, in that finding accommodation that will allow her to take a baby is practically impossible. So she's living in cheap hotels where she has smuggled in an infant daughter and is keeping her out on the fire escape so that there is no problems about noise complaints. So Gabby, mother of 4, says, this just won't work. Come and work for me. You can move into my house. We'll find daytime nursery accommodation for the baby. Everything will be fine. And that's what happens. Elsa Schiaparelli moves in with Gabby, becomes a salesperson until all of the clothes are sold, and Gabby goes back off to Paris with the proceeds and lives on it. Then Elsa boards out her baby out in the countryside and takes a bizarre range of jobs. She goes on a Cuban tour as the personal assistant of an opera singer who can't sing. That's kind of like the whole point of the performance. She learns how to develop colour photography and is blind for a while when the chemicals get in her eyes. She has a short, very, very short-lived job as a reader of ticker tape on Wall Street. And she decides that actually this isn't going that well. Then her baby becomes ill. It becomes clear that the baby can't walk properly. And polio is diagnosed, and she decides she really needs to head back to Europe for treatment. So when she had been recuperating from the blindness, she had been in a kind of a chalet down in Woodstock. Next door to her had been an American woman called Blanche Hayes. She was mid-divorce, or rather she was wanting to get divorced, but she was independently wealthy, and she wanted what was called a Parisian divorce. So in the 1920s, lots and lots of wealthy American women would go and get their divorces in Paris. because although it was stricter on paper, it was actually easier to get your divorce. And this is crucial, women were more likely to be able to retain their own money. So she needed somebody to go with her and help her with all of the formalities, somebody who spoke French and who would help her get the apartment, because she'd need to be a resident, and to fill out all the forms. So together they hatched up a plan that Elsa, who had no money, would go with Blanche. Blanche would pay for everything. Elsa would be kind of a companion, and she would help her with the divorce. They would live together in an apartment. They would take the baby with them. And that's what happened. Elsa and Blanche moved to Paris. Sometime in this, Elsa is mixing with couturiers. She becomes a friend of Paul Poiret, who was sort of an earlier stage couturier. She starts making some clothes for friends. She is interested in sportswear, which is this new category of clothes. After the First World War, you still have people who are really wealthy and who spend their time just going on leisure pursuits right the way around the world. So they'll go skiing, and then they'll go to the beach and all of this kind of thing. And their wardrobes, therefore, have to have an unending supply of sports clothes, things for either doing sport or for watching sport. Jumpers, shorts, culottes, swimsuits, and so on. And Elsa felt that she herself looked terrible in what was available. She was 5 foot tall, and she felt that all of the available outfits clung in the wrong places and just made her look funny. So she started making her own things, and then for friends. And in that way that there's often these very informal businesses, particularly amongst women, I think, that spring up where you're just making things for friends, but it is a commercial transaction. She wanted to have a proper business. So she spoke to Blanche, who she was, really good friends with, and Blanche said, I think I have somebody who might invest in your business. And this was a woman called Edna Hartley. Now, in most of the literature, she's only called Mrs. Hartley, and she's described as a socialite. But what she was wanting was a small, woman-owned business in France to invest in. Now, to me, that isn't being a socialite, that is being an angel investor. That is putting your money into something that you believe. It is to be the person who allowed Elsa Schiaparelli to start her business. It is incredibly important thing. So to be Mrs. Hartley, socialite. Anyway, so what was arranged was that Mrs. Hartley would buy an existing sort of fashion house, Maison Laballe, and Schiaparelli would design and sell from it, and it would be her business, and she would be able to play with her ideas. So she designed a range of sportswear, and it sold well, and it got coverage in American magazines, which again, as all of her friends at this time, her contacts, were American based, I'm assuming is something to do with contacts and these women putting her forward, making sure that she got publicity. In 1927, she saw an American friend wearing a jumper with an unusual knitting construction. Now, one of the problems that she was having with knitwear was that it was quite clingy, and if you weren't straight up and down, it didn't suit you, the shapes. And secondly, that swimwear was a great problem. Now, swimming and swimwear were a massive market that was opening up, and the idea of brightly coloured, designed swimwear was really in the air at this time. There's another artist slash clothes designer, Sonia Deloney, working in Paris at exactly the same time. And she designs a range of 50 swimsuits, knitted swimsuits, which are kind of like an installation. They're an art installation, but they are very abstract, very bright, but not designed to sell, even though she was selling other things at the time. So this idea of swimsuits, knitted swimsuits, really important. But they were fine, you see, for sunbathing. But as soon as the women wanted to do anything, actually go swimming, they would stretch and they would sag and they would go out of shape. So I think that when Schiaparelli saw this different knitting construction, this is what she had in her head, that she could make knitted items that wouldn't have that droop and sag but would still be knitted. She asked the American friend, where did you get that jumper? And the friend said something like, oh, it was knitted by an Armenian refugee woman. And Schiaparelli asked to be introduced. So they went along. Now, the V&A suggests that it may well have been kind of like a factory kind of thing, though the jumper was definitely hand knitted, but certainly an established kind of business run by a woman and her husband. And there were lots and lots of Armenian refugees had settled in France, and many of them were in textiles. But when she got there, the woman didn't speak French or Italian or English, and they didn't have any kind of common language. So they found a young woman called Elsa Schiaparelli, who was a young girl. She had gone to an American school in Armenia and was on her way to become a nurse in Britain. And she did the translation, and they worked on how the stitches were and how it worked and what were the kind of parameters that you could do this in. And Arsiag, who became known as Mike, didn't ever make it to become a nurse. She became Elsa Schiaparelli's secretary and workshop manager for the knitwear, and stayed all of her life working for Elsa Schiaparelli. And she explained the knitting stitch technique, which is basically running two very fine wools, knitting one and carrying the other one on the back. So when I came home, I did a swatch of knitting here, and I chose lace weight cashmere, which is 228, so very, very fine. The swimwear that Schiaparelli produced was all in cashmere, so this is pretty much the same. And I managed to get the correct gauge by using 1.75 millimeter needles. And hopefully you can see here the technique. I think of it as doing intarsia with a ferrule technique. So you've got all of the caught-in floats at the back there, and it's just that you're using a different one of the yarns at the front. And what this gives you is it stretches normally going down, because there's no difference normally, but going across the way, it doesn't stretch nearly as much, and you have a fabric that will drape but not cling and doesn't go soggy in the wet. So Schiaparelli commissioned jumpers and asked about the technical thing. Could two different colours be used? Could one show through the other? Could the back sort of thread be used sporadically on the front to knit motifs? And they worked out designs. Now, what's interesting here is that in Schiaparelli's origin story, this is like an overnight success. This is something that happened very, very quickly. But there is evidence that it's actually 4 years. So it's 4 years from her seeing the jumper and starting to experiment with the technique, possibly as just the bicolour front and back, knitting up like tweed, possibly with abstract designs. But then in 1927, she asked the knitters to do a trompe l'oeil design. with a bow at the front. She sketched out a bow and she said that she wanted that as though it was tied at the neck, but to be part of the jumper. They knitted it, the first one, and it was a bit lopsided, and the second one, it didn't really work, and the third one, it's very, origin stories often have three things. It's Goldilocks and the three bears. And the third sample was perfect. So shortly afterwards, she was going to an industry lunch. Elsa Schiaparelli wore this jumper to somewhere where there was going to be lots of buyers and lots of press. She deliberately made a late entrance because she was somebody who was always early for everything, but she made a late entrance and didn't wear a coat, so she just showed off this jumper, and immediately everybody wanted one. And a buyer from an American store, this is what she writes in her biography, came and ordered immediately 40 jumpers to be delivered in 2 weeks. Now, quite a lot to unpack here. I absolutely believe that in 1927 she went to that lunch and there was a big thing, and that the buyer was there and placed an order, because such a competitive field, if you saw something you would place an order. Elsa Schiaparelli says it was Strauss department stores, but it wasn't. It was a department store on Fifth Avenue in New York called Taylor and Lord. It was a woman called Dorothy Shaver. Now, Dorothy Shaver was amazing. She was a promoter of people. She was a connector of people. In 1916, she and her sister were making handmade dolls, and she took them round the department stores. One of the department stores was Taylor and Lord, and she got a job there as a comparison shopper. So she would go to all of the department stores and she would do like a comparison reports. And from then on, she moved up. 11 years later, 1927, the year that we are talking about, she was appointed to the board, Taylor and Lord, first woman. And immediately she started her sort of passion project, which was to bring French art-inspired design to the department store. And that was in clothes, and it was in homeware, it was everything. And 1928, she organised a big exhibition, but from 1927, she was buying. She also, later on, she had an amazing career, but she was really fundamental to the promotion of American female designers right the way through, sort of like 1940s, 1950s. So she was really important. Now here she was as the buyer who bought the 40 jumpers. So at this point, production had to scale up, because things up until that point had just been like things for 1 or 2 people. Now she needed 40 and she needed them quickly. So Mike organised all of the Armenian knitters to start doing these, because it's very fine needles, it's very fine yarn, it's, they're not quick knit sweaters. They were made up in Elsa Schiaparelli's apartment. They made the deadline. And I think this is quite an important thing, that the deadline was so tight because people copied Paris fashions in America incredibly quickly. So if you had not been able to get your 40 jumpers in 2 weeks, the copies may well have got into the other shops before them. It's not just a fast fashion thing, it's quite cutthroat. And this was the big break. Vogue featured the jumper. There were hundreds, thousands of copies. There was a knitting magazine published a pattern in 1928 for the American home knitter to do it, and you can still get a download of that on Etsy. And that's really interesting because the gauge was made much bigger for the American home knitter, moving from like a 1.7 millimeter needle to a 3.25 millimeter needle, moving from lace weight to what must have been about 4 ply. So still fine knitting by our standards, but a much bigger gauge for knitter. So at that point, this is kind of like, this is just amazing. You know, this is going viral for Elsa Schiaparelli, and she gets big ambitions. And at this point, Edna Hartley goes, I'm really an angel investor. I'm a startup investor. I don't have the capital to help you scale. I think that we should close down Maison Lamballe and you should start with a new investor. And that's what happens. Maison Lamballe is closed, not because it's a failure, but because this is the start of the Schiaparelli brand. And lots of people wanted to invest, and Elsa Schiaparelli chose Monsieur Kahn, who had a big holding in Galeries Lafayette, so knew the scene. He'd also been supporters of previous women designers like Madame Vianney. So it was a really good choice. And from that point on, she moves out of being exclusively sportswear to do evening dresses and all of that amazing stuff, which I will show you in another video. But today, what I really wanted to say is, you know, when you unpick history just a little bit, you find the women, and you find the women supporting the women and making it easier and using their wealth. I remember this is a time where, you know, in lots of places, you know, women couldn't have bank accounts, women couldn't sign leases. It's just at the time that you're beginning to get women's suffrage in America, but not everywhere. And it is a time of great change. And it's a time where particularly women seem to be very proactive, the women who have money, in supporting creative women who don't have money, creative women who are single parents, all of that kind of thing, to allow this creativity to bubble up. And I think it's very, very important that all of those women who use their resources to help other women move out of the shadows, move out of being the buyer, the socialite, the social butterfly, and have proper names and proper roles and proper stories. So until next week, bye bye.